Deep in the interior of the Asian continent, passages through the mountains have always dictated human behavior. From the ancient trade routes of the Silk Road to the modern industry of the Central Asian nations, the valleys will always remain the cradles of life. At the tangled core of three nations, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, stretches the largest such valley, Fergana. Glancing at a modern-day map of the region, Fergana's division between the three nations is bewildering. Fragmented into a perplexing mosaic of enclaves, international boundaries shift from one village to the next. Border walls snake along river banks and divide agricultural lands. There are even a sprinkling of fenced-off enclaves which do not contain a settlement inside. Yet for such an ancient region, tensions in the valley only developed in the last 20 years. How did such a tangled cultural environment remain as a uniform piece for so long, but only erupt with conflict in the 21st century? At 22,000 square kilometers in area and over 300 kilometers long, the Fergana is wedged between the Tian Shan Mountains to the north and the Gizar Alai Mountains to the south. For an arid region punctured with barren alpine peaks and small grass-filled pastures, the Fergana possesses another key element to human life: water. Two fertile rivers called the Narin and the Karadarya merge in the valley to form the Sirdarya, which flows thousands of kilometers west to the Aral Sea. Due to its area, resources, and convergence of various ethnic groups, the valley is by far the most populated in Central Asia, home to 14 million people, housing almost a quarter of the region's population in only 5% of the land. The population density is much higher than in the rest of the constituent nations. At such a prominent location connecting the area between China, Islamic empires and Europe, the Fergana Valley has shifted through many phases of governance during its history. Emperors from both the east and the west arrived over centuries to stake their claim in the Eurasia's greatest land bridge. The first to do so was Alexander the Great, capturing a fortress at the western entrance to the valley and establishing a city in 329 BC. He named it Alexandria Eschate, or Alexander's Furthest. It remained under Hellenistic rule for 200 years, until the Han dynasty sieged Alexandria Eschate, proclaimed their own king for the region. The Han and later the Tang Empire split influence in the region, with other Turkic and Islamic invaders from the south and west, fighting many wars protecting their brink of East Asia. Everything changed after the most fierce and cunning warriors of the millennia arrived, the Mongols. For the next 600 years, the region was ruled by remnants of their lineage, which assimilated with the local Turkic traditions. This Mongol-Turkic fusion is still retained by the inhabitants of the region today, who are split into three main ethnic groups. There are the Kyrgyz, a Turkic group encompassing the east of the Fergana. Although ethnically distinct from the Mongols, their customs share many similarities. Nomadic for most of their history, Kyrgyz live in yurts and utilize horses to follow livestock through seasonal migrational patterns. Their lifestyle favors high alpine pastures, and they typically live at higher elevations than other inhabitants of the valley. There are also the Tajiks, a Persian group native to the Fergana. During the Mongol-Turkic reign, the adoption of Islamic religion increased their cultural foothold, as the Mongol-Turkic rulers adopted traditions from present-day Iran. Unlike the Kyrgyz, the Tajiks are sedentary, living in villages. The Tajiks inhabit the southern stretches of the Fergana Valley, namely with the culturally significant stronghold of Khujand. Thirdly, there are the Uzbeks, who genetically are the most heterogeneous mixture of Mongol and Persian people. But today, their culture retains more similarities to other Turkic nations. The Uzbeks' influence in the region mirror the rise of Mongol-Turkic rule, a convergence of Mongol imperial ambition and Islamic culture, most prominently through the reign of the last great conqueror of the Eurasian steppe, Timur the Great. A descendant of Genghis Khan, he united Uzbekistan into a singular nation and begun constructing the infamous architectural splendors of Samarkand. The legacy of such great authority in the region is still apparent in modern-day politics. Uzbeks are the largest population in the Fergana and occupy most of its area. The complexity of the region is added to with other minority inhabitants, such as the KASHGARIANS, KIPCHAKS, BUHKARIANS, Bukharian Jews, Uyghurs, Romani, Russians, and even Germans all call this region home. Throughout all of this time and various inhabitants, Fergana never arose with its own independent identity. Although Timur, and a legion of other emperors overturned the region, they also conquered the lands of all of the various ethnicities. As such, there was never a claim to whose lands belonged to what people. All of the diverse cultures existed peacefully side by side under the reign of one large power. Additionally, these ethnic delineations were not often considered by the inhabitants. Identity was based on clan and religion rather than a unity in ethnic similarity. The Russians were the last of the arrivals to assert their influence in the Fergana. They integrated the valley into Russian Turkestan in 1876 and once more swept over all of the lands in Central Asia, extending to the Chinese border. Although there was some dissent among locals against Russian rule, there was little to imbalance the powers inside the Fergana. Life continued as usual under the imperial rule of the Russians. But the first cracks in the Fergana emerged after the communist overthrow and under the new Soviet regime. The complications of modern-day borders in the Fergana are often misattributed to Joseph Stalin. Before he became a leader of the Soviet state, Stalin worked as a commissar for nationalities. As part of a campaign to administer and industrialize the outlying area of the Soviet state, Stalin was tasked to divide the Union into republics along ethnic lines. Although there was never before a united Tajik, Uzbek, or Kyrgyz state, Stalin initialized the process of grouping ethnic groups into political entities. The story goes that he fragmented the Fergana at random, scribbling the lines and creating troublesome boundaries that still remain today. Although Stalin did initiate the process, the border delineations continued as a complex bureaucratic bargaining game from the 1920s until the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviets were always paranoid about Central Asia uniting and rebelling against their rule, so they deliberately set the capitals of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan far away and over arduous mountain passes from the Fergana Valley, and cut it up in a way that would make it difficult for any one country to take it without upsetting the other two. This divide and conquer strategy prevented the Fergana Valley from uniting as the natural power center of Central Asia, making it easier for Russia to control it. As a result, if Uzbekistan wants to march an army into the valley, the easiest path is through Khujan in Tajikistan. But because Uzbekistan doesn't control Khujan and the surrounding flat piece of land, Uzbekistan is forced to supply the valley over a narrow, winding mountain pass through a tiny neck between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, as shown in this video. This pass contains two vulnerable tunnels. Blow up the tunnels, cut off the valley, an easy target for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan if they wanted to prevent Uzbekistan's access. Take Sokh, for example, a modern-day part of Uzbekistan, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan. With a population of 50,000, it is one of the largest exclaves in the Fergana Valley. Surprisingly, most of its residents are ethnically Tajik, despite its location. Its border was drawn in 1955 for unclear reasons, and so Sokh is a tense place with a clash over a spring recently occurring in May of 2020, resulting in 25 serious injuries. In 2013, there was a conflict over a power line, which resulted in the shooting of Kyrgyz hostages. And 14 years before that, in 1999, Uzbekistan accused Sokh of being a hotbed of radical Islam. Tensions in the Fergana Valley today rest on the interplay of economics and ethnic ideology. Stalin is certainly to blame, but just as much as the entirety of rule under the Soviets. However, it was not only a negative misalignment by the Russians. Due to their investment, the region underwent never before seen industrialization. Border redrawing was done to favor commercial ventures. Tending the resource-rich land of the Fergana became the principal goal of the Soviet state. Republic lines would shift to allow a larger labor force to work on the same farm, or to ease the construction of an infrastructural project. As such, transportation and utilities in the region were not designed with the consideration of republics using them autonomously. With the weakening of Soviet rule under Gorbachev, nationalistic ideologies began to surface, especially in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. The greater economic flexibility favored Uzbeks as they were traditionally businessmen, farmers, and merchants. Such a disbalance created greater tension in the allocation of resources, as now there was the ability to profit off of them. In 1919, such tensions erupted into violence in the city of Osh in Kyrgyzstan. While an Uzbek nationalist group promoted culture and identity, a Kyrgyz nationalist group demanded the redistribution of a predominantly Uzbek collective farm, one of the first ever Kyrgyz-Uzbek clashes in Central Asia. For the rest of the 90s, the Fergana remained calm. Despite the official international borders, trade and the interconnection of resources continued as before. In 1999, an unexpected shockwave triggered a new surge of security in the region, the Tashkent car bombings. Although unknown who perpetrated the attacks, Uzbek President Karimov blamed a radical Islamist movement called the IMU. As a response to greater security, his progression of the Uzbek identity, and his closed-off approach to foreign policy, Karimov installed a militarized barrier in a disputed area with Kyrgyzstan. The political move worsened the lives of all residents in the area, as it split apart families, hampered commerce, and worsened the economy of an already struggling region. Over the next 10 years, Uzbekistan continued to reinstate what were previously unrestricted boundaries with Kyrgyzstan. The drawing of such lines was never straightforward, and peace agreements were hard to come by. Areas along both sides of the borders contained diverse ethnic settlements from both nations. In addition to the disruption of trade, Uzbekistan started to seize vital water sources, which greatly impacted the living standards in Kyrgyzstan. Such nationalist moves created chasms in communities, not only from Uzbek offenses.
The country of Kazakhstan. It locates between Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and assholes Uzbekistan.
The most globally covered of such incidents occurred in 2010, in a bloodier, more violent repeat of the 1990s Osh riots. The instigation of the violence is unknown. Some claim the formerly ousted Kyrgyz president wanted to cause instability in the region. Others blame Tajiks for arriving and inflaming both sides. What started as a fight at a casino erupted into several day-long chaos, leaving 420 dead and forcing 80,000 Uzbeks living in Kyrgyzstan to flee to Uzbekistan. Since then, government relations still remain tense, but conflicts of such magnitude have not been repeated. Yet, recently tensions are rising once more, exacerbated by the economic decline with the pandemic and a whole list of contemporary problems. There are additional long-term trends affecting Central Asia in ways that could exacerbate or provoke violent conflict. The mountainous upstream states, which have water but do not have hydrocarbon sources of energy, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, prefer to use water to generate electricity in the winter, while the downstream states, which are rich in hydrocarbons, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, prefer to use the water during the summer for agriculture. Normally, the downstream states agree to sell the upstream states' natural gas in the winter for heating in exchange for releasing water during the summer for irrigation. This is a practice dating back to the Soviet Union, which used to do the delicate balancing for the Central Asian states, keeping the system running. However, once the collapse happened and the industries became privatized, this process started to break down, with water becoming the heart of many diplomatic disputes. Additionally, agricultural overuse has stressed the region's supply and led to the shrinkage of the Aral Sea over the last few decades. Climate change will further compound the water resource challenge, as the glaciers in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan that supply Central Asia with water are now rapidly melting. Actually, this means that at the moment, there's a higher than average river flow, increasing available water for the next decade or two until it's gone. So the current urban, agricultural and energy infrastructure of the region is being built around an existing supply of water that will greatly diminish for the next generation. Seeing as water is not yet scarce and is already a source of contention, this may dramatically worsen the situation. All 5 Central Asian countries, although historically Muslim, established political systems that were secular, in other words, non-religious. This generally fit with the international norms on religious tolerance and freedom that the West was recommending to them. It also seemed like a great improvement over the intolerant Soviet legacy of scientific atheism. Yet the revival of Islamic religiosity and culture is one of the most noticeable trends in Central Asia over the last 3 decades. A vast increase in both religious practice and personal cultural identification with Islam is evident in homes as well as in shops, restaurants, and other public spaces all over Central Asia. This reflects not just the revival of local Islamic practice from before the Soviet era, but also the exposure of Central Asia to other non-native forms of Islam. The governments of the region have had an uneven and ambiguous history with this phenomenon, and they have at times cracked down on outwards expression of Islamic identity, including banning hijabs in school or in passport photos, shaving the beards of men on the street, and preventing celebrations of Islamic holidays. On the other hand, all of these governments and their presidents have slowly become patrons of Islam. They have supported the construction of mosques and paraded their personal devotion. Broadly speaking, the revival of Islam on a large scale in Central Asia has been largely about finding personal meaning and communal solutions to social problems. But for small groups of the disenfranchised or alienated individuals who might already have been seeking pathways to violent empowerment, the pull of Islamic extremism, ISIS in particular, has provided an opportunity to act. In response, governments in the region crack down on extremism and encourage safe forms of religious expression. However, upon the collapse of ISIS in Syria, Central Asian governments adopted policies based on repatriation of citizens caught up in the Middle East conflicts. As a result, in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, thousands of prisoners convicted of extremism were released from detention. Tajikistan adopted a policy allowing returning foreign fighters who admitted their mistakes and repented to be pardoned. Most surprisingly, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan took the lead in identifying their citizens in refugee and detention camps in Iraq and Syria, and in 2019 began bringing them home on dedicated flights. Central Asia turned out to be well ahead of the rest of the world, including Europe and the United States, in taking on the problems of repatriating its citizens. But these Central Asian militants fighting in Syria making their way home have the potential of destabilizing the region in a big way. Those to me seem to be the biggest issues, but there are also the usual threats, which aren't particularly unique or surprising. There is the problem of organized crime, largely fueled by the movement of heroin and poppy from Afghanistan to Russia and Europe through Central Asia. This movement has played a supporting role in much violence and political corruption. And then there are ever-present neighbors. Central Asian powers are destined to be used as pawns in the geopolitical chess play between the much larger giants that surround them. The tug of war between the East and the West in this culturally diverse region with various allegiances is likely to cause much hardship now, as it has in the past. And I won't even get into the eccentric and authoritarian leaders who do their best to maintain power in their respective countries. One thing is clear, although the groundwork for conflicts was laid down by Russian rule, it has become nearly an unsolvable issue of economics, ethnic identities, and global change. And Fergana Valley, with its various exclaves, is at the very center of these problems, where violence and tensions are most likely to erupt in the not-so-distant future. If you would like to know a bit about these amazing buildings and more about the history of this region, then click the card. Now, if you enjoy this content, please consider going over to my Patreon. Long-term sponsors get added to my Patreon map. Also, I'm dabbling with maps, and you may find something you like at geoperspective.org. It's really the best way to support me. Now, guess where this footage was taken, and I will see you soon. Geoperspective out.